The termination meeting lasted exactly 6 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the conference room wall the entire time, its second hand ticking with a mechanical indifference that felt almost obscene given what was happening across the table, some detached part of my brain deciding that counting seconds was easier than actually processing the words coming out of Gordon Hale's mouth. I'd walked into that conference room at 9:08 that morning expecting to discuss the Morrison account, a client relationship I'd spent 4 months carefully rebuilding after a data migration error nearly cost us the contract. I'd brought my laptop, a printed deck outlining the revised timeline, even a coffee for Gordon, because that was the kind of small, thoughtless courtesy 11 years of working alongside someone builds into your muscle memory, whether or not the person deserves it. I set the coffee down in front of his usual seat before I even registered that Priya from HR was already sitting there, a manila folder squared perfectly in front of her, its edges tabbed with small colored flags I recognized immediately, having sat on the other side of that particular kind of folder more times than I wanted to count during my years overseeing terminations in the engineering division. "This is purely a restructuring decision," said Gordon, not quite meeting my eyes, his gaze fixed somewhere just past my left shoulder on the window overlooking the parking lot, on anything that wasn't my face. He was the CEO of Kestrel Analytics, the company I'd spent 11 years building from a 4-person startup crammed into a shared co-working space into a firm with 300 employees and a client roster that included half the Fortune 500's data infrastructure needs. I'd known him since before any of it existed, since the two of us used to split a single desk and argue about server architecture over gas station coffee at 2 in the morning. The board felt a change in leadership direction was needed, effective immediately. "I built the analytics division from nothing, Gordon." My voice came out steadier than I expected, though something in my chest had already started to hollow out, the particular vertigo of watching a floor disappear beneath you in slow motion. "I hired 60% of the engineering team myself. I closed the Meridian contract personally, the one that's currently 40% of our recurring revenue. What exact leadership direction are we changing?" "The board felt your management style had become..." He paused, glancing briefly at Priya, who offered no help, her eyes fixed on the folder, misaligned with where we're taking the company next. "There's a new strategic vision. Your role, unfortunately, doesn't have a place within it." "Which board members?" I asked. "Because I sit on that board, Gordon." I would have remembered a vote. Something flickered across his face then, quick and involuntary, gone almost before I registered it, but I'd worked alongside this man for over a decade and I knew every one of his tells, knew the particular way his jaw tightened when he was navigating around a truth he didn't want fully examined. It was handled through an executive session. Standard procedure for personnel matters. "Which is exactly why we know you'll land on your feet," he continued, sliding the folder across the table like that settled everything, like 11 years could be tidied away with a severance package and a compliment about my resilience. "The board felt a change in leadership direction was needed, effective immediately. Priya has the details on your package. It's generous, Rachel. More generous than most." I looked down at the folder without opening it, at the crisp corner Priya had aligned so precisely with the edge of the conference table, and I thought about every late night I'd spent in this very room, whiteboard covered in architecture diagrams, Gordon and I ordering takeout at midnight while we figured out how to keep the company from folding during our second year, back when neither of us had any idea if any of this would actually work. I thought about the year I'd spent traveling to enterprise clients on my own dime when the travel budget ran dry, closing deals that kept payroll running. I thought about the 3 days I'd spent in the hospital with my father, answering client emails from a waiting room chair because I couldn't imagine letting the company falter even during that. "I signed nothing," I said, and I stood, my chair scraping against the floor louder than I intended. I took my badge off, the laminated card with my photo from 6 years ago, my hair shorter then, my expression more naive, and set it on the table because some old habit told me that was the dignified thing to do, the professional exit even in the middle of what felt like a professional assassination. Gordon didn't reach for it. Neither did Priya. It just sat there between us, a small plastic rectangle representing 11 years reduced to an object nobody in the room wanted to touch. "Rachel," Gordon started, something almost like regret crossing his face for the first time since I'd walked in, though I no longer trusted myself to read it accurately. This isn't personal. Everything about building this company was personal, Gordon. For both of us. I don't know how you've managed to convince yourself otherwise. I walked out past the glass-walled offices of people I'd personally recruited, people who looked up from their monitors with expressions of confused alarm as I passed, none of them yet aware of what had happened, though I suspected word would travel through the building within the hour, the way it always did. I walked past the open floor plan I'd fought 2 rounds of contentious board meetings to fund, back when half the leadership team wanted a more traditional cubicle setup and I'd argued, successfully, that the collaborative space would pay for itself in retention and creative output within 18 months. It had. I walked past the small kitchen area with the espresso machine I'd personally researched and purchased after our 3rd year of profitability, a small luxury I'd fought for because I believed, genuinely, that taking care of the people building something mattered as much as the thing itself. Out into a parking lot at 9:14 in the morning, the sun already climbing, uncomfortably bright against a sky that hadn't gotten the memo about how the morning was supposed to feel. I was holding a cardboard box someone had apparently pre-packed with the contents of my desk plant, a framed photo of my parents at my college graduation, a mug with a chip in the handle I'd meant to throw away for 2 years and never had. The fact that it had been packed before I arrived, box taped and labeled and waiting, told me everything about how long this had been planned, how many conversations had happened in rooms I hadn't been invited into. I sat in my car for a long time before I could make myself turn the key. Not crying, exactly, though my eyes stung in a way that suggested tears were somewhere close, held back by sheer force of will and a stubborn refusal to let this be the version of the morning I remembered later. Just breathing, slowly, methodically, the way I'd learned to do during the company's worst financial crisis years earlier, trying to understand how 11 years of building something, of missed birthdays and canceled vacations, and a marriage that hadn't survived the hours I'd poured into this place, could end in 6 minutes and a pre-packed box sitting in the passenger seat like an indictment. I thought about calling my ex-husband, then immediately dismissed the idea, some old reflex reminding me that particular well of support had run dry years ago, another casualty of the company I'd just been evicted from. I thought about calling my sister, who would be sympathetic but useless in any practical sense, who worked in elementary education and would have no idea what recourse, if any, existed for something like this. Then, sitting there in the parking lot with the engine still off, the box beside me, my badge somewhere back on a conference room table I'd never sit at again, I remembered the term sheet. Not vaguely, not as some hazy recollection of paperwork signed long ago, but with sudden, startling clarity, every clause of it surfacing in my mind like it had been waiting exactly for this moment to become relevant again. 3 years ago, when Kestrel had been circling bankruptcy after losing our biggest client to a competitor who'd undercut us by nearly 40% on price, I'd personally negotiated a bridge loan from a private investment group to keep the company afloat, back when Gordon was too busy blaming the sales team in increasingly tense all-hands meetings to actually solve the problem himself. I remembered those months with a clarity that surprised me now, sitting in the parking lot with the engine still off, the sleepless nights modeling cash flow projections, the 4 separate investment firms that had turned us down before Highgate Capital finally expressed interest, the terrifying week where payroll had come within 11 days of failing entirely. I'd been the one to fly out to Highgate's offices in Chicago, alone, because Gordon had a prior commitment he wouldn't specify, though I later learned it was a golf outing with a college friend, a detail that still made something in my stomach curdle whenever I thought about it. I'd sat across from Elena Voss, the firm's managing partner, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of unhurried, watchful demeanor that made you choose your words carefully, and I'd negotiated the terms of a bridge loan that would keep 300 employees' salaries funded for another 18 months while we rebuilt our client pipeline. The loan had come with conditions, standard enough on their face, convertible notes, 2 board observer seats, quarterly reporting requirements. But I remembered, with startling clarity now, the additional clause I'd insisted on myself, over the strenuous objections of Kestrel's own outside counsel, who'd argued it gave the note holders too much unilateral power that could theoretically be used against the company's own management team. I'd pushed for it anyway, quietly, in a private conversation with Elena after the main negotiating session had wrapped, because I hadn't trusted Gordon even then, not fully. Not after watching him take sole credit for a product launch I'd spent 18 months building from an early prototype into the feature that ultimately saved our largest remaining account. I want protective language, I told Elena, sitting in a hotel bar in Chicago after the term sheet's broad strokes had been agreed to, both of us nursing glasses of wine we were too exhausted to actually enjoy. Something that protects the company's operational integrity if leadership decisions get made in bad faith, without proper board process. Elena had studied me for a long moment, the kind of look that made me suspect she understood far more about my working relationship with Gordon than I'd explicitly told her. You're worried about him pushing you out. I'm worried about a lot of things, I'd said, which wasn't quite an answer, though we both understood it as one. The clause we'd eventually drafted, tucked into Section 7.3 of the note agreement, was simple in its language but sweeping in its implications. If senior leadership changed without full board unanimity and documented cause, the note holders retained the right to convert their debt to equity immediately at a preferential conversion rate that would give them controlling interest in the company. I'd built that provision specifically as an insurance policy against exactly the kind of quiet, engineered ouster Gordon had apparently just pulled off, though I'd never truly believed, not in my heart, that I'd ever actually need to use it. I remembered explaining it to Kestrel's counsel afterward, framing it as protection for the company's stability during a fragile period, a technical safeguard rather than the deeply personal insurance policy it actually was. He'd signed off on it eventually, satisfied by my explanation, never suspecting the real reason I'd wanted it in place. Gordon himself had barely glanced at Section 7.3 when reviewing the final term sheet, more concerned with the interest rate and repayment schedule than with governance language he considered lawyer stuff, a phrase he used dismissively for anything that didn't directly touch the product or the sales pipeline. I remembered a specific afternoon, the two of us reviewing the document together in his office, him skimming past entire pages while I read every word twice, and some part of me, even then, understood that I was building a safety net he didn't know existed, for a fall he didn't yet know he'd cause. I pulled out my phone and called Elena Voss, managing partner at Highgate Capital, my hands steadier now than they'd been 10 minutes earlier, some old instinct for crisis management reasserting itself the way it always had during the company's roughest periods. She picked up on the second ring. "Rachel," she said, warmth in her voice, the easy familiarity of someone who'd spoken with me regularly over the past 3 years during quarterly investor calls. "This is a surprise. Everything all right?" "Elena, it's Rachel Cade. I need you to check something for me." I kept my voice level, professional, though my heart was going harder than I wanted to admit. Was my termination approved unanimously by the full board this morning, or did Gordon push it through some kind of executive session without full board participation? There was a pause on the line, the sound of typing, a keyboard clicking rapidly in the background. "Wait," Elena said, something sharpening in her tone. "You've been terminated? This morning?" 9:08, I said. 6-minute meeting. Gordon cited a restructuring decision and a change in strategic direction. I asked which board members approved it. He got cagey about executive session procedure. More typing. "Give me 10 minutes, Elena said, and I could hear something shift in her voice now, a kind of focused urgency replacing the earlier warmth. "I have a feeling I already know the answer, and if I'm right, you're about to have a very interesting afternoon." The line went quiet, and I sat there in my car, the cardboard box still beside me on the passenger seat, feeling something strange settle over me. Not quite hope, not yet, but the first flicker of something adjacent to it, the recognition that I might not be as powerless in that parking lot as I'd felt walking out of the building 15 minutes earlier. While I waited, I scrolled back through old emails on my phone, pulling up the board meeting minutes from the past several months, the ones I still had access to through my personal archive since I'd always kept copies outside the company's internal systems, a habit born from watching too many startups lose critical documentation during platform migrations over the years. I found the most recent full board meeting, 6 weeks earlier, and confirmed what I already suspected. No vote regarding my termination had appeared on any agenda, No discussion had been documented in any minutes I'd been party to, which meant whatever had happened, it had happened outside the proper channels entirely, in some room I hadn't been invited into. Among board members who'd apparently decided my 11 years of work could be dismissed without so much as a formal vote among the full slate of directors. I thought about the two other board members beyond Gordon and myself. Diane Ferris, a former operations executive who joined our board 2 years ago and who I'd always found sharp and fair-minded, and Thomas Reyes, an early angel investor who'd been with the company since its earliest days, back when we were 4 people in a co-working space arguing about server architecture. Neither of them, I realized now, had reached out to me that morning. Neither of them had given me any warning, any indication that a leadership change was even under discussion. Which meant either they'd been kept out of it entirely, ambushed the same way I had been, or they'd been quietly consulted and had simply chosen not to tell me. I didn't have long to sit with that uncertainty. My phone buzzed 12 minutes later, Elena's name appearing on the screen, and I answered before the first ring had even finished. "Rachel," she said, and I could hear something in her voice now that hadn't been there before, something that sounded almost like barely contained energy, the tone of someone who'd just found exactly the leverage she suspected she'd find. "I need you to sit tight for the next hour, and I need you to not sign anything Kestrel sends you, not even a simple acknowledgement of receipt."
Can you do that?
"I already didn't sign the severance paperwork," I said. "What did you find?" "I found," Elena said, "that Gordon Hale just handed us the company." I sat in that parking lot for another full hour after Elena's call, engine still off, box still beside me, watching employees I recognized trickle in and out of the building for early lunches, none of them yet aware of what was quietly unfolding in a series of phone calls and emails happening entirely outside their view. Elena had asked me to wait, so I waited, though every minute felt like it stretched longer than the last, my mind cycling through 11 years of memories I hadn't let myself fully access since walking out of that conference room. At 10:30, Elena called back, her voice carrying the particular brisk energy of someone who'd spent the last hour on back-to-back calls with lawyers. "Okay," she said. "Here's where we stand. Gordon pushed your termination through what he's calling an emergency executive session with himself and one other board member, Thomas Reyes, who apparently agreed to it over the phone yesterday evening without seeing any formal documentation, based entirely on Gordon's characterization of, and I'm quoting from the minutes Gordon's assistant filed this morning, irreconcilable strategic differences. Diane Ferris wasn't consulted at all. No advance notice, no vote, nothing. So it wasn't unanimous, I said, though I already knew the answer. Some part of me had known at the moment I'd watched Gordon's jaw tighten in that conference room. It wasn't unanimous, and more importantly, it wasn't full board participation, which is the specific trigger language in Section 7.3. 2 out of 4 sitting board members, one of whom didn't even see the actual grounds in writing before agreeing verbally. That doesn't meet the threshold Kestrel's own bylaws require for a leadership termination of this magnitude, let alone the specific carve-out we built into the note agreement. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice now, the particular pleasure of a lawyer watching a carefully built contingency finally prove its worth. "We're exercising the conversion right, Rachel. Effective immediately. Highgate's debt converts to equity at the preferential rate, which puts our ownership stake at 58% of the company." I sat with that number for a moment, feeling it settle into something concrete. 58%. Controlling interest, Elena confirmed. Which means, practically speaking, Highgate now has the authority to reconstitute the board, and reconstituting the board is exactly what we intend to do within the hour. "I'd like you back in that building by 1 o'clock, Rachel, not as a terminated employee walking in to collect the rest of her things, but as the person the new board is prepared to reinstall as CEO if you want it." I hadn't expected that last part, hadn't let myself imagine anything beyond simply reclaiming my job, my department, some semblance of the life Gordon had tried to erase in 6 minutes. "CEO?" I repeated. "Highgate didn't invest 3 years ago because we believed in Gordon Hale," Elena said, something almost wry in her voice now. "We invested because you walked into my Chicago office and negotiated terms so carefully calibrated that even now, 3 years later, they're protecting you from exactly the kind of self-interested leadership decision Gordon just made." That's not luck, Rachel. That's judgment. We'd like that judgment running the company, not managing an analytics division underneath someone willing to torch 11 years of institutional knowledge over what increasingly looks like a personal power grab. I asked her what she meant by that, and she explained, briefly, what her team had uncovered in the hour since we'd last spoken, that Gordon had, apparently, been in preliminary talks with a competing firm about a potential acquisition of Kestrel's client contracts, talks that would have been substantially more lucrative for him personally if he'd first consolidated control by removing anyone likely to object, anyone with enough institutional history and board relationships to slow down or complicate a rushed sale. I hadn't been fired over a vague strategic realignment. I'd been fired because I was an obstacle to a deal Gordon intended to push through quickly, quietly, and almost certainly at terms that would have shortchanged both our employees and our existing investors in favor of a payout structure that benefited him disproportionately. Something cold settled into my chest hearing that, colder than the shock of the termination itself. 11 years, and the man I'd built this company alongside had been prepared to sell it out from under everyone the moment I became inconvenient to that plan. "I'll be there by 1, I said. I spent the next 2 hours in a diner 3 blocks from the office, my laptop open on the sticky table, coffee going cold beside me, working with Elena's team to draft the reconstituted board resolution, review the specific language of Section 7.3 one more time to make absolutely certain there were no gaps Gordon's lawyers could exploit, and prepare a brief statement for the employees who would need an explanation for whatever was about to happen in that building. Diane Ferris called me directly around noon, her voice tight with an anger I recognized because it mirrored my own. "I had no idea," she said. "Nobody told me any of this was happening." Thomas apparently agreed to something over drinks last night without even reading the actual justification Gordon gave him. "I'm furious, Rachel, and I want you to know Highgate has my full support in whatever they're planning. They're planning to reinstate me as CEO," I told her. "With your vote, if you're willing to give it." "Gladly," she said, without a second of hesitation, and something in my chest loosened slightly for the first time since 9:14 that morning. At 12:47, I walked back into the Kestrel Analytics building, no cardboard box this time, no badge either since mine still sat somewhere in that conference room, but Elena walking beside me now, along with 2 associates from Highgate's legal team carrying folders far thicker than the one Priya had slid across the table that morning. The receptionist, a young woman named Beth I'd hired myself 2 years earlier, looked up with visible confusion as we approached the elevator bank. "Miss Cade," I thought. "I know what you thought," I said, not unkindly. "It's all right, Beth. Is Gordon in his office?" He was, and when Elena's associate knocked and we walked in without waiting for an invitation, I watched the exact moment Gordon's expression shifted from irritation at the interruption to something closer to genuine alarm, watching Elena Voss walk into his office at 12:52 in the afternoon, folders in hand, flanked by the woman he'd fired 3 hours earlier. "Elena," he said, standing, some forced cordiality straining his voice. "This is unexpected. If this is about the note agreement's reporting requirements, I'm happy to schedule a call for." "This isn't about reporting requirements, Gordon." Elena's voice was calm, almost pleasant, though there was steel underneath it that I recognized from our very first negotiation years earlier. "This morning you terminated Rachel Cade's employment without full board unanimity, in a session that included only yourself and Thomas Reyes, who agreed verbally without documented cause or written justification. That triggers Section 7.3 of our note agreement. Effective as of 11 this morning, Highgate Capital has converted its outstanding debt to equity, giving us controlling interest in Kestrel Analytics at 58% ownership." Gordon's face went through several rapid transformations, confusion, disbelief, and finally something that looked almost like fear, the particular fear of a man realizing the ground beneath him had shifted entirely while he'd been occupied with something else. That clause was never meant to apply to routine personnel decisions. "It applies to exactly the circumstances it describes," Elena said, sliding a folder across his desk, the mirror image of the gesture Gordon himself had made that morning, though I doubted he registered the symmetry. "And we're also aware, Gordon, of your preliminary discussions with Viridian Systems about acquiring Kestrel's client contracts. Discussions that happened without board knowledge, without proper disclosure to your existing investors, and which appear to have directly motivated this morning's termination. Gordon's silence, in that moment, told me everything I needed to know, confirmed everything Elena's team had uncovered in the 2 hours since I'd sat in that diner watching my coffee go cold. As majority shareholder, Elena continued, Highgate is exercising its right to reconstitute the board effective immediately. Diane Ferris remains. Thomas Reyes will be replaced, given the circumstances of his verbal approval this morning. And Rachel Cade is being reinstated as Chief Executive Officer, effective 1 o'clock today. I looked at the clock on Gordon's office wall, the same brand as the one in the conference room where he'd fired me, and it read 12:58. 2 minutes. You can't do this, Gordon said, though his voice had lost the authority it carried that morning, thinned out now into something closer to disbelief. I built the protective language myself, Gordon, I said, speaking for the first time since walking into his office. 3 years ago, because I already knew, somewhere, that you might do exactly this eventually. I hoped I was wrong. I wasn't. At 1 p.m. exactly, the reconstituted board formally ratified Elena's resolution, Diane Ferris's vote joining Highgate's controlling stake to confirm my reinstatement, and just like that, less than 4 hours after walking out of a building with a cardboard box and a chipped mug, I walked back through it as the majority-controlled, board-approved Chief Executive Officer of Kestrel Analytics. Gordon was escorted out that same afternoon, his own box packed by security rather than prearranged with quiet cruelty the way mine had been, and I spent the rest of that day meeting with department heads, reassuring 300 employees who'd spent the morning in confused, anxious speculation, and drafting a company-wide email that made no mention of triumph or vindication, only continuity, stability, and a plan to move forward. That evening, once the building had emptied and I sat alone in the office that had briefly, for 4 hours, belonged to someone determined to sell out everything we'd built together, I allowed myself, finally, a single moment to simply feel it. Not gloating, not quite relief either, but something steadier than both. The particular satisfaction of having protected something worth protecting long before I understood exactly why I'd need to. I picked up my chipped mug, still sitting in the cardboard box someone had thoughtfully retrieved from my car and placed back on my old desk, now restored to its rightful place, and I thought that some insurance policies you build hoping you'll never have to use them. And some mornings, you're simply grateful, against every expectation, that you built them anyway.